remains were the bones of adults. Men, women, people who had lived full lives and then ended up in the same place as the babies. Which raises a question no one in Hollywood wanted to ask. What kind of society throws both its newborns and its grown citizens into the same disposal site? This video is about what Sparta actually was, not the movie version, not the motivational poster version. The version that turned a 7-year-old boy named Leonidas into the kind of man who would march 300 fathers to a narrow pass in northern Greece, knowing none of them would come back. And the version that explains why, 2,500 years later, we still haven't figured out what we're really applauding. Before we go any further, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This is the kind of history they left out of the textbooks and Hollywood cleaned up. Hit subscribe, it is free, it takes 1 second, and it helps us keep making these videos. Now, let us get back to it. To understand what Leonidas became, you have to understand what Sparta sat on top of. Sometime around the 8th century BC, the Spartans conquered a neighboring region called Messenia. The people living there, the Messenians, were not killed. They were not driven out. They were absorbed. They became the Helots. The Helots farmed the land. They harvested the grain. They pressed the olives, tended the livestock, and produced the food that fed every Spartan household. Without the Helots, Sparta did not eat, and the Helots outnumbered the Spartans. Ancient sources vary, but some estimates place the ratio at 7 Helots for every 1 Spartan citizen. Others go higher. The exact number is debated, the imbalance is not. This created a problem that shaped every decision Sparta ever made. The entire Spartan economy depended on a population that had every reason to revolt. The Messenians had not chosen subjugation. They had been conquered, they remembered, and they waited. In the 7th century BC, they did revolt. The Second Messenian War nearly broke Sparta. Ancient sources describe a conflict so desperate that Sparta came close to collapse. The poet Tyrtaeus, writing during or shortly after the war, produced verses urging Spartan soldiers to hold the line, not against a foreign empire, but against the people working their own fields. Sparta survived that war, but surviving it changed everything. After the Messenian revolt, Sparta reorganized itself around a single priority, making sure it never happened again. Every institution, every ritual, every law that followed can be traced back to one calculation. How do a few thousand citizens maintain permanent control over a population that vastly outnumbers them? The answer was not walls. Sparta famously had none. The answer was not technology or wealth. The answer was the total restructuring of Spartan life around the production of one thing: obedient soldiers. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families. This was not optional. This was not a boarding school for the ambitious. Every male citizen's son entered the Agogia, the state-run training system that would occupy the next 13 years of his life. The boys were organized into groups called agalai, herds. Not classes, not cohorts. Herds. They were given 1 cloak per year, no shoes, no bedding. They slept on rushes they had to pull from the riverbank themselves, by hand, without a blade. Food was deliberately kept insufficient, not by accident, not through scarcity. The rations were calculated to leave the boys perpetually hungry. They were expected to supplement their meals by stealing. This is the part that gets repeated in documentaries as if it were clever, a training method for future soldiers. But the full mechanism was more specific than that. If a boy stole food successfully, nothing happened. He ate. If a boy was caught, he was beaten. The punishment was not for the theft, it was for the failure, for being detected. Plutarch records the story of a Spartan boy who stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak. When an adult approached, the boy stood still. The fox began clawing and biting into his stomach. The boy said nothing. He did not move. He died standing, his intestines opened by the animal, rather than reveal what he had stolen. Whether that specific story is literal or apocryphal, the fact that Spartans told it to each other as a model tells you what the system valued. Not strength, not intelligence, the suppression of visible suffering. As the boys grew older, the training escalated. They were organized into competitive units and encouraged to fight each other. Plutarch describes organized brawls, where boys punched, kicked, and bit with no rules and no intervention from adults. The purpose was not to find the strongest. It was to identify who would keep fighting after the pain became unbearable. At certain stages, boys were subjected to public flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. This was not punishment, it was ritual. Boys were whipped until they bled, and the measure of success was silence. Pausanias, writing centuries later, noted that some boys died during the ritual. The priests monitored the flogging by watching a wooden statue of Artemis. When the image grew heavier, the blows were considered sufficient. Foreign visitors came to watch. By the time a boy reached 18, he had spent over a decade in a system designed to accomplish something very specific. Not education, not enlightenment, conditioning. The agoge produced men who could endure pain without flinching, who could obey without questioning, who could stand in a phalanx formation for hours in summer heat, wearing 60 pounds of bronze, and not break rank when the man next to them took a spear through the throat. This was the system that produced Leonidas. He entered it at 7. He graduated from it as a man who had never known a single day of autonomous decision-making. Every meal, every sleeping arrangement, every act of violence and deprivation had been managed by the state, and the state had one use for him. There is a part of Spartan training that does not appear in the movie 300. It does not appear in most popular accounts of Sparta at all. It is called the Krypteia. Each year, Spartan authorities selected the most capable young men, those who had excelled in the agoge, and gave them a specific assignment. They were sent into the countryside at night, alone, armed with a dagger. No armor, no supplies. Their mission: move through Helot territory and kill any Helot who appeared strong, organized, or capable of leadership. Plutarch describes this directly. The young Spartans hid during the day and emerged at night. They targeted Helots, working the fields, traveling the roads, or gathering in groups. The killings were not battlefield engagements. They were nighttime operations carried out against unarmed laborers. This was not a rogue practice. It was state-sanctioned. Each year, the Spartan ephors, the elected officials who governed alongside the kings, formally declared war on the Helots. This legal declaration served a specific function. Under Greek custom, killing during peacetime carried religious pollution. The annual declaration of war removed that obstacle. Any Helot killed by a Spartan during the Krypteia was killed within a legal framework. The targets were not random. Thucydides records an incident during the Peloponnesian War that reveals the logic. The Spartans announced that Helots, who had served with distinction in battle, should come forward to be honored. Around 2,000 Helots presented themselves. The Spartans crowned them, paraded them past the temples, and then every single one of them disappeared. No one, Thucydides writes, could say how each of them was killed. 2,000 men, selected for competence, eliminated because competence in a subjugated population is a threat. The Krypteia operated on the same principle, applied continuously. The system did not wait for rebellion to begin. It removed the potential for rebellion before it could organize. This is the context that is missing from every popular telling of Leonidas and the 300. The men who stood at Thermopylae were not simply warriors trained for external enemies. They were products of a system designed, first and foremost, for internal control. The skills that made them effective in the phalanx, obedience, silence, the capacity to kill without hesitation, were the same skills they had practiced on Helot farm workers in the dark. One of the most frequently cited facts about ancient Sparta is that Spartan women had more freedom than women elsewhere in Greece. This claim requires context. Spartan women could own property. They could inherit land. They exercised publicly and received physical training. In Athens, women were confined to the household. In Sparta, they moved through public space with a degree of autonomy that shocked other Greeks. But the purpose of that autonomy was specific. Spartan women were physically trained because Sparta believed physically strong mothers produced physically strong sons. Plutarch states this explicitly. The exercise regimen, running, wrestling, throwing the javelin, was not designed for the women's benefit. It was designed to optimize their reproductive output. Marriage customs reflected the same priority. Spartan brides had their heads shaved and were dressed in men's clothing for the wedding night. The groom, who had spent his entire life in the company of men, would visit briefly in the dark, then return to his barracks. Some scholars suggest this ritual was designed to ease the transition from the all-male bonding of the agoge to heterosexual contact. Husbands under 30 continued to live in their mess halls. They visited their wives in secret. Plutarch says some men fathered children before they had ever seen their wife's face in daylight. If a marriage did not produce children, the state intervened. Xenophon describes an arrangement where an older husband could introduce a younger man to his wife for the purpose of conception. If a man admired another citizen's wife for her bearing and temperament, he could request access to her, with the husband's consent, to produce children. These were not scandals, they were policy. The Spartan system treated reproduction the way it treated military training, as a state function that could not be left to individual preference. The goal was not family. The goal was population maintenance. Sparta needed a steady supply of boys to enter the agoge, survive the crypteia, and take their place in the phalanx. Every institution served the machine. And this explains something about Thermopylae that the popular legend skips over entirely. When Leonidas selected his 300, he chose men who had living sons. Every single one of the 300 had already produced an heir. This was not romantic. It was not a sentimental gesture toward fatherhood. It was the state calculating acceptable losses. If these men died, their genetic contribution had already been secured. Their sons were already in the agoge. The pipeline was intact. Leonidas was not selecting heroes. He was selecting men whose death would cost the system the least. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire under King Xerxes assembled one of the largest military forces the ancient world had ever seen. The exact numbers are debated. Herodotus claims over 1 million soldiers. Modern historians estimate the actual force at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000, still enormous by ancient standards. The target was Greece. Xerxes had reasons. His father, Darius I, had sent an expedition to Greece 10 years earlier. That force had been defeated at the Battle of Marathon by a primarily Athenian army. The defeat was an embarrassment. Xerxes intended to finish what his father started. The Greeks knew the invasion was coming. They had time to prepare. And they did, partially. The problem was timing. The Olympic Games were approaching, and the Carneia, a major Spartan religious festival, was underway. Spartan law prohibited military campaigns during the Carneia. This was not a suggestion. It was a binding religious obligation. And so Sparta sent 300 men. Not 300 because that was enough. Not 300 because Leonidas believed a small force could defeat an empire. 300 because it was the maximum Sparta would deploy during a religious festival without violating its own laws. This is consistently left out of the popular narrative. The 300 was not a dramatic choice. It was a compromise between military urgency and religious calendar. But Leonidas did not march with 300 men. He marched with roughly 7,000 Greek soldiers. The Spartans were a fraction of the total force. The rest came from Thespiae, Thebes, Corinth, Arcadia, Phocis, and other allied Greek states. These men, farmers, tradesmen, citizens of small cities, marched alongside the Spartans to the pass at Thermopylae. The pass itself was a tactical selection, not a poetic one. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was a narrow coastal corridor between the mountains and the sea. At its narrowest point, the pass was wide enough for a single wagon. This meant that the size of the Persian army became irrelevant. The Persians could not bring their full numbers to bear in a confined space. They would have to funnel through the pass in manageable groups, exactly the kind of close-quarters combat where heavy Greek infantry held the advantage. For 2 days, this worked. The Greek coalition held the pass. The Persians sent wave after wave, including the Immortals, Xerxes' elite unit, and each wave was pushed back. Herodotus describes the fighting as grinding and relentless. The Greeks rotated units in and out of the front line, with the Spartans taking the most demanding shifts. The pass held, the mathematics of terrain were working, and then a local man named Ephialtes changed everything. Ephialtes approached the Persian camp and revealed the existence of a mountain path, the Thermopylae trail, that led around and behind the Greek position at Thermopylae. The path was not unknown. Leonidas had posted a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers to guard it. But when the Persian immortals advanced along the trail at night, the Phocians retreated to higher ground to defend their own position rather than blocking the path. By dawn, the Greek army at Thermopylae faced encirclement. When word reached Leonidas that the Persians were behind them, he made a decision that has been interpreted as heroic sacrifice for 25 centuries. He dismissed the bulk of the allied army. The specifics of this decision matter. Herodotus gives 2 versions. In one, Leonidas ordered the allies to leave because he wanted to spare their lives. In the other, the allies left on their own when they saw the situation was hopeless, and Leonidas simply did not stop them. What remained was a force of roughly 1,500 men, the 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, who refused to leave, and a contingent of about 400 Thebans, whose motivations are debated. Herodotus suggests they were kept as hostages rather than volunteers. The Thespians are worth pausing on. These were not professional soldiers. Thespiae was a small city. Its 700 men represented a significant portion of its military-age male population. They chose to stay, knowing the situation was terminal, and they are consistently overshadowed in every retelling. No movie has been made about the 700 Thespians. No motivational poster carries their name. They died in the same pass, on the same day, fighting the same enemy. The reason for the remaining force was military, not symbolic. Someone had to cover the retreat of the departing allies. If the entire Greek army turned and ran simultaneously, the Persian cavalry would ride them down in open ground. A rear guard needed to hold the pass long enough for the main force to gain distance. Leonidas volunteered his Spartans for that role. Now, the selection principle becomes critical. Every one of the 300 had a living son. This was not coincidence. It was deliberate criteria. Sparta had a finite number of citizens. The Spartan population had been declining for decades. Every full citizen who died without an heir represented a permanent loss to the system. One fewer soldier in the next generation, one fewer family contributing to the mess hall. By selecting men who had already reproduced, Leonidas ensured that the demographic cost of the rear guard was minimized. Their sons would continue through the agoge. Their land holdings would pass to their heirs. The system would remain intact. This is the calculation that sits beneath the legend. On the final day, Leonidas moved the remaining force forward, out of the narrowest part of the pass and into a wider section. Herodotus describes this as a deliberate shift. The previous 2 days had been fought in the bottleneck. Now, with encirclement inevitable, Leonidas chose to inflict maximum casualties on the open approach. The fighting was different on this day. The Greeks knew the geometry had changed. There was no rotating out, no relief force waiting. Herodotus says they fought with a ferocity that exceeded the previous days. Spears broke. The Greeks switched